introduce you and then we can... Hello, BookTube. Well, as you can see, I have a guest. This is Hannah from Hannah's Books, who certainly needs no introduction here in BookTube. Care to wave to my imaginary BookTube friends? And we are here on a specific bookish topic today, a topic that was raised by Robert G., reader of books. Bob came up with a tag about rereading.
A fantastic tag. It's
Ah,
so interesting. Yeah.
wonderful, and it really struck a nerve, a chord, I should say, not a nerve. I should say that I'm so annoyed with Bob. I'm right on the edge of... It struck a chord because rereading is such an active subject for readers. And I made a video about it. I thought it was a really interesting subject. And of course, you're a lifelong reader. In fact, you've been reading for more of your life than I've been reading in my life. You strike me as the type that was born and weaned on books.
I definitely started reading early. And the first book that I think I reread that wasn't a picture book that my parents read to me, which I certainly listened to the same books over and over and over. I think the first novel that I reread as a kid was Little Women, which I think the first version I read was an abridged version, but I read it every year for years. So, yeah, yeah.
Were you were you one of those kids? Did your parents ever tell you, or were you one of those kids who pretended that you were reading before you knew how to do it, turning the pages and studying them?
I don't think so. Um, my well, instead of telling that story, my son very much did that. That he would pick up a book, even if it was an academic book or a science book that David was reading or whatever, and he would hold it there and read aloud and just tell some story. And it was so much fun to watch.
I've heard that story in variations from so many parents that their kids loved the activity of it so much. They wanted to be a part of it so much.
He actually did the same thing with writing. Which is a story I haven't heard before. But when I was writing, he would have a piece of paper and a crayon and would be sitting next to me. And at some point, he just filled page after page with scrawl in a yellow crayon. And at the end, he handed it to me and said, I wrote a story. Would you read it to me? I'm like, I can't read it to you. So it's like, I can't really read your handwriting. So finally, he sort of filled me in on what the basic topic was. And so I made up some story, which was not my strong suit there. But yeah.
But it sounds like in your own case, you were a rereader literally from the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think all kids are, whose parents read to them, that kids just have this natural desire to hear the stories that they know over and over and over again, enough that it often drives parents crazy. But yeah, so.
How has that changed for
Mhm.
you over the years? What is rereading to you now?
I still read an awful lot, both books for comfort and books that I have grown with so much over the years that I feel like there's something still to be learned from them. It's not just comfort. Although, of course, I also learn from the books that I'm reading just for comfort, to be honest. Um, yeah, I
Have you ever had the experience of a book that you reread for comfort suddenly lose its ability to comfort you? Have you ever been
that's
disappointed
interesting.
in an age-old reread? Just suddenly disappointed in it, where it's just
I
not what...
don't I don't think so. I'll have to think about that.
Mm.
No, I don't think so.
And what about the odd phenomenon? I mentioned it in my own tag, in my own version of this tag. What about the odd phenomenon of a book that you reread so many times that you know it already,
Yeah,
about it already, and still you reread it?
yeah. And Jane Eyre is like that for me.
Jane Eyre,
And
like that
so
for
much
me.
so that there are times where, I just have 15 minutes where I want to read some passage. And sometimes I open it randomly and sometimes I look for particular moments. But yeah, it's part of my DNA. It's not a book anymore. I mean,
Not
it's
a
a book
book
for other
anymore.
people, but
Right. And those moments, I think everybody who rereads particular set of books has that phenomenon where there are moments, there are things that are especially effective. Is Do you get the impression now that that is a question of the effectiveness of those moments, or would they have that effect anyway just because you've trained yourself? are you repeating there a remembered set of feelings?
Yeah, I think so, at least with that book. That's not true for everything, but I think for Jane Eyre, it certainly is. And then there are times where totally new things appear too. For example, with Jane Eyre, there had been a year or two when I hadn't read it, um, back when I was a graduate student. And due to my own illness at the time and my teaching job and my dissertation, I wound up learning a lot about disability. And when I read Jane Eyre, it's like there's throughout the entire book, there are all these references to disability, and it actually plays a pretty substantial part in the story as well. And I had never heard that language, much less thought about sort of its implications. And so suddenly this whole new, and not just that I was seeing disability representation or whatever, but that it was this thematic part of the book that I had pretty much not picked up on before.
I have something of this similar experience actually with Jane Eyre, where I'd been reading it for the vibrant emotions, the roiling anger all throughout it, and it just been spellbinding me my first couple of times reading it. And then I read it while hiking in the area where it's set in winter. And
Oh,
suddenly
wow.
how utterly gorgeous the physical world is represented in the book. It's amazing. It's not
Yeah.
just scenery. It's amazingly alive.
Oh, I have to try that sometime. I need to take a like Jane tour or something.
Oh, there are probably packaged.
There probably are.
Oh my. Oh
Yeah.
my. Mine was not packaged. It was just a bunch of beagles.
Yep.
But
Yeah.
are there contenders other than Jane Eyre that come immediately to mind?
Well,
Your
there's
Eudora Welty, for instance?
Eudora Welty is definitely on there, and Flannery O'Connor. And really, it's only their short stories that I reread as consistently. And both of them, Flannery O'Connor just never brings comfort. It's a different kind of experience. But Eudora Welty very much does. And her stories, I mean, I love Why I Live at the PO and The Worn Path and stories like that. But there are two other stories of hers, Good Country People and Revelations, which I adore. And both of them involve a nerdy young woman who uh, gets put in her place, essentially. And you can just tell that Flannery O'Connor is writing about herself at those moments. And as a nerdy young woman who needed to be put in my place occasionally, I've always found those very meaningful.
I have spent most of my life as a nerdy young woman who needs to be put in her place.
Yep, yep. Um,
I'm
Try
curious.
those.
The phenomenon that we're describing in biographical terms almost. And I'm wondering, this phenomenon, the phenomenon of a book that passes into what in my tag I call prayer, where it's largely unconscious, it's not really reading anymore. You just said it's not really reading anymore.
Right,
Is
right.
that phenomenon something that is dead? Can you imagine a book doing that now? Has a book done that in the last 10 years for you?
In the last 10 years,
Just 10 years. Yeah.
um, I think
Or,
I've read a couple of books that will be like that.
okay, I was just going to say, or if a book hasn't done that, are there books that you think could do that,
Yeah.
where you do go back,
Um,
you do go back to them?
yes, yes. And one of them is Paul Kalanithe's book, When Breath Becomes Air, which I guess I read in 2017 for the first time. It was only a year or two old, and I think it's not very old. And I had gone through breast cancer treatment and gone through chemo and had really been unable to read for a while. And I read that, which is it's a physician's experience of being diagnosed with cancer and then dying, and then his wife writing the very end of the book. And I found the book so powerful when I was recovering. And then when my husband got sick, I read it again. And then I've read it a lot when thinking about how to write about that experience as well. So it's definitely the book that I think I've read on repeat so often in the last 10 years. And it has, and maybe as I grow past some of those experiences more and more, it won't. cement itself into me, but I think it will always at least be part of my memory of these years, these last few years. Um,
Are there any candidates that you think might not just grow out of that role? I'm thinking here, for instance, of the uncommon reader. Uh,
oh yes, I mean, yeah, the uncommon reader would certainly be it's a forever thing. I'm not sure I didn't read tests of the D'Urbervilles until very, very late in my life. And it certainly is going to be there. I don't think I have the history with it yet, that it really feels like it's part of me, but I think it might be. And I'm sure it will be, actually. It doesn't bring me comfort, but it does bring me a kind of pleasure of going back to this world that I still feel like I'm learning, but I'm meeting anew on the page each time.
can you tell with a book like Test, if you encounter it late in life, or the uncommon reader, can you tell when you're reading it the first time that there's a chance?
Absolutely, that I'll be
Really?
reading it again. Yeah, and I'm such not a plot reader that to a degree, I don't think even if the end of the book seemed weak, that it would keep me from going back to it again and again and again, because there's something of so that almost feels like recognition.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
No, usually I think in my experience with a book like this, it can have a horrible ending and it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I think of Ring of Bright Water, for instance, which the first time you read it, the second time you read it is going to be completely overshadowed by the heartless, whimsical tragedy of the
Yeah.
conclusion of the book. But I could say the same thing about the Jungle Books, where because I want Mowgli to stay in the jungle forever, and he doesn't. Uh,
Hmm.
it doesn't matter though. The ending like that doesn't matter. I don't think. Well, same thing with Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
I'd go back over and over again to the Holmes canon, and the Holmes canon for me, and I think for a lot of people, is always the 1880s, the fog-shrouded
Hmm.
streets of London, with Queen Victoria on the throne.
Right.
You don't like to remember that that in the last story, Holmes is talking to Watson about an east wind blowing from the continent.
Yes.
Well, you
Yeah.
don't want to think about the world intruding on
Right.
21B
Sure.
Main Street. Uh,
And I think that actually brings up I mean, the Holmes are stories that, so many are mysteries, but that mystery is just not really exactly the point. And so having a story that at what point does that spoil a book? And I don't believe in spoiling books, at least for me, but I don't really think it's true for anybody. But with a good mystery, you can read the same mystery over, or at least I can read the same
I
mystery
can.
over and over and over and appreciate it more and more. So
I've known some murder mystery fans who did not feel that way. I
yeah.
knew one diehard murder mystery fan that said, "All right, I might not remember in the first two chapters whether or not I've read this book before. The minute I remember that I have read it before, it's going to scald my fingers. I can't get away from it fast enough." But most mystery fans I've known, the good mysteries, they can read them over and over again.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but
And it might be different for people who read mysteries that are super plot driven, where I tend to read ones that are more character based, I think. So
well, even the plot-driven ones, diehard Holmes fans would much rather, if you gave them the choice, you can either learn exactly what Sherlock Holmes's life was like in the last 2 years of that he was alive, or you can finally learn the details of the giant rat of Sumatra. You know exactly which they'd pick. They don't care about it. They want the mystery. They don't want the rest of it. They want the atmosphere. Uh, but
well,
I that
I've
so
just I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
I've just reread Edith Wharton's Age of Innocence for the first time in a while. I I think this is probably my third reading. One was I was quite young, and one I was sort of in the middle, and so it's probably been a decade at least since I've read it. And I was really struck. I didn't think about it at the time, but because as I was reading, but I was buddy reading it, and there'll be a video coming soon, eventually, between the two of us, but
With Joe Spivey.
with
Yes.
Joe Spivey.
Every
But
better reads with me because I smell.
um,
No, since you've been here to Hyde Cottage and had to close
yeah,
your
it's
nose
it's
the
hard, but
whole
if you go in with allergies, it makes it a lot easier. Um, but while reading with him, he was reading it for the first time, and I realized how much of my interpretations of some of the things that were happening were shaped on the fact that I knew the basic arc of the story. And in my memory, I kind of knew that along and along. But now I have no idea if that's really true or if I just sort of put that, once I finished the book, that I sort of rethought back on some of, oh, yes. So
That's
it was
interesting,
interesting.
that I can infer from that story that this novel is not one of your constant touchstone rereads.
It's not, although for a long time I thought I liked House of Mirth tremendously more, and I think I've changed my mind. It took me a while to fall in love with Edith Wharton, um, only because the one and only book I had read, I absolutely hated. It's the main book, Ethan Frome, and I hated it so much. I actually
Almost
did.
goes without saying. If someone says, "Oh, I read one Edith Wharton book and
Yes, it's
I
going to be
hated
that
it," you
one.
almost don't need to ask. It's of course
Yeah,
Ethan Frome.
yeah. Well, I've made a video about why I hated it and when I first read it, and it's just a really, really long story. So if anyone's curious, go check it out. But yes, it's a book I now appreciate a bit more. But it put me off Wharton for quite a while, so I was pretty late to the party.
Yeah, I worry about, well, nothing I can do about it, but I worry about it. Ethan Frome is taught in schools because it's so short. And you have
Right.
to wonder how many people are saying, "Oh, I'm never going to read
Yeah.
this stuff again."
So frequently,
You
people teach really short books, even when they're really not accessible, as accessible as some of the longer books that,
yeah.
even Age of Innocence is not a long book. And it's so much more inviting. Yeah.
I can just imagine how many people read Ethan Frome, work their way through it, and then see Age of Innocence and say, "Oh no, 4 times as long with this
Yeah.
author? No way."
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I once upon a time, decades and decades ago, it was popular in some schools to do the same thing with George Eliot
Oh.
by inflicting a longer short story of hers on people,
Hmm.
as opposed to even a shorter, effective book. But but uh,
Yeah. I mean, Mill and the Floss is one that I think I know that you don't like, um, but I think that's a reasonable choice. And Adam Bede is one that I didn't know till BookTube, actually. I had never read Adam Bede, but it was part of the Knit and Listen during Booktober of 2017 or 2018, I guess, when I started. I think I started in 2018 or maybe 2019. I don't know, a while ago. Um,
they didn't
Probably
invite me because I
2019.
smell.
It was open to anybody, but you had to knit. So yeah.
I don't knit.
But yeah, I read Adam Bede and was like, I thought this was going to be terrible, and it was fantastic. Um,
But
yeah.
getting back to the subject of rereading, I want to know still how open this turnstile is. How active a process is this? You're still open to finding what you called forever books?
Yes. And I hope I will be forever. I mean, theoretically, that
Something
even if,
brand new, like raising hair.
yeah, I've now read a quarter of it. It's the people, um, chosen book, and having to spread this short book over the course of a month. This I may fail at that. I may absorb it all before
They didn't
then.
invite me because I smell. You notice the theme here.
Yeah, yeah.
It's the burden I live with. But you would you know, like for instance, you say you're reading Raising Hair incrementally. For those of you who don't know what we're talking about. It's a forthcoming book about the writer finds a leveret, finds a little baby hare and saves it and raises it, and the hare is never domesticated, but they do live together part of the time. They do know each other, and the writer of the book sees the hare in all sorts of moments of relaxation that presumably very few people have ever seen. Maybe naturalists that go and track them in the wild, but otherwise, no. Certainly never in a house. Uh, and reading this thing incrementally, slowly for this anti-Steve event, would you, how soon would you know? at the very least that you are someday soon going to reread it. I presume that you wouldn't ever know right away that it's a rereading talisman book.
I don't think so. I'm like I said, I've read a quarter of it now, and while I'm really, really enjoying it and finding it utterly charming, I don't know that I'm pretty sure it will not become, a part of my DNA. I don't think it's that kind of book. But that I'll want to reread it at times, I think that's totally possible. There are a lot of nature books that I put in the category of, oh yes, I'm going to reread this when I need something calm.
Right.
Um, but that I don't really see as um part of me. Um,
I have to ask, I have a feeling I fear I know what the answer will be, but I have to ask, when we're talking about the roster of these forever books, these books that become part of your DNA, is there anything in your roster that's ancient?
yes,
Yay.
uh, Antigone, which I first read at 16, maybe. Um, and thought, okay, so I thought I was Jane Eyre, but actually I'm a cross between Jane and Antigone. And it was formative in who I became or who I realized I was or became, I don't know. Um,
Do you remember? I'm assuming it was a translation. Do you remember whose
yes.
translation it was?
I don't know. It was in a school textbook. And I don't think we were reading the story for class, but I was reading reading around in it. And so that would have been in the early 80s. So probably one of the common um
Either just there were basically two translations at the time, so it would have been either Richmond and Lattimore or Green and Lattimore, or it would have been Fitz and Fitzgerald.
I'm guessing it's Fitzgerald just from having read other translations of those two. I think Lattimore I would have had a different reaction to.
But you felt it. It entered into your DNA,
Oh
Antigone.
yes, instantly, instantly. I mean, it was saying that I was Jane Eyre and I was Antigone, or wanted to be Antigone. Uh, I instantly felt like, oh, I know these people. They're they're former me's in some way.
So what is
But
it that determines a return visit to these books? You've got Little Women just sitting on the shelf. What is it that would determine, oh, I want that now? And is it a different thing that would determine a dip versus a whole reread?
yes, I think a whole reread often happens because some issue brings up the book. Um, Rather than just something reminds me of the book, but that some issue that I want to explore, or sometimes a film that's come out that has cast it in a different light, like when the relatively new film came out of a Little Women. I wanted to go revisit it to see if some of the things that it was doing, how they related to the book, as opposed to my memory of the book. But often when they're um, intellectual issues that have popped up in some other frame, um, uh, which actually I might get to it in a little while. But yeah, when I'm just dipping in, it's usually because I want something that will feel like home, that will calm me down, that
So
will,
only sometimes can it be external factors
yes,
that
yeah.
put. So
I mentioned to you in a Voxer, I think that I ran across three different copies of Joe's Boys on a walk to the Metro, which is a 10-minute walk. I passed three little free libraries with different editions of Alcott's Joe's Boys, the sort of second follow-up to Little Women. And that certainly sent me back to Little Women. It did not send me back to Joe's Boys yet, but it probably
Yes, and to the horror of a very, very old Irish bog trotter, it did not send you back to those little free libraries. You obviously had to get all three of those editions or you would die. But yeah,
No, I decided I did not need to get them, but
good.
I
And you're
did
still
think a
alive.
lot about what story, why are all three of these appearing right now? Was there a neighborhood book club or, what was the issue? Yeah. Actually, I went to the same little free library today and
Oh,
got this, which I'm really excited about. I have not read these letters, so yeah, May Sarton is
you're
a
better with little free libraries than I do. That's for sure.
especially a couple of them. There are a lot of professors in this area, and I wanted to go knock on this person's door and say, "Hey, do you know who did this? Who put this in there?"
I'd
Yeah,
almost
I'm
wonder
thinking
if
about a May Sarton read along, maybe a May in May. So,
I wonder if maybe going back to one of these DNA books for outward reasons might lessen it a little, might make it feel suddenly.
it makes it more expansive, if anything. I mean,
Oh,
I can still go back to it in the I'm reading this for what I already know, but that it's also, what new is in it, which is always intriguing.
and what about the prospect of rereading one of your DNA books with someone new? So not Edith Wharton, a book that you read once every decade or so,
Right.
something that you know backwards and forwards. How would it change, for instance, reading Jane Eyre?
Well, it's actually been somewhat difficult to listen to all the conversations on BookTube about Jane Eyre sometimes. Sometimes they're fantastic. But when people are just like, oh, her relationship with Rochester is so terrible, and I'm like, you're missing the point. Which of course they're not. They're reading it with different eyes from what I read. I did not think of it as romantic in any way. This was not a story about romance in my view when I first read it. I was pre that interest, in fact. So even if it were a bigger part of the book, I don't think it would have really struck me that way. In the same way that when I read Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, the first time I read it, there was nothing about romance in it as far as I was concerned. It was about sisters. And similarly with Jane Eyre, it was about a young woman who wanted to be independent, who wanted to be herself and be honest and be free and be treated with respect. Um and so, condemning Rochester seems like, why would you do that? But of course it's been really fascinating to sort of think that out. And
This that touches on something that I it's a difficult thing to phrase without sounding sold on myself, but or on ourselves. It's a problem that any booktuber will have the potential to experience, which is it possible that when it comes to these DNA books, there are some booktube conversations that you simply can't join in on? Ironically enough, that you've read the books, you know it so well that you actually can't talk about it with people who are encountering it for the first
I
time.
don't
I
know.
always think that when I have encountered that myself, where I've seen people, nobody wants me, of course, to join in their booktube discussions, but if they did, I always think, well, there's no way that you could do it anyway, because
Hmm.
they're all reading it for the first time. And then whenever I feel that way about when I see that kind of a thing, I always think, well, surely that's a failure of pedagogy.
Yeah.
Surely that is a failure on my part to
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
able to enter that conversation. But could you do it?
Uh,
What if a whole bunch of all these young, you know, clean-shaven young men who've suddenly swarmed onto BookTube in their dozens? What if they decided to have a Jane Eyre read-along? Could you join them?
I think I could. Yeah. I mean, I would definitely hold my tongue about a lot of things. And that's not a super easy book to hold your tongue about, actually.
But what kind of things would you hold your tongue on?
Well, I think there are characterizations that I would want to um, talk about that to a degree you sort of uh, get more depth as you see what happens in the latter part of the story. And there are, I think, especially in Jane Eyre, there are things that people consider clear spoilers that are so early in the book compared to what I mean in general, it's like I just don't say what's going to happen in the latter part. But the latter part, the very last part, which is just, I mean, it's not a spoiler. Everybody knows that's what's going to happen at the end. I think everybody would know what's going to happen at the very last page, but or last chapter. Um, but the way it happens from the middle to that point is a really informative section about Jane's character. And so talking about how Jane's youth affects her choices later on is something that I want to talk about when I read that book.
Well, right.
Wouldn't want to do it with a new reader.
No, right. It's the weird dividing line between being in a group read of a book and teaching the book to the group read.
Oh yeah, and I would want to avoid that as much as
Right,
possible.
right.
I think
And
one of the complications with Jane Eyre specifically is because she's telling a story as someone looking back, that both stories are happening at the same time if you already know the whole book, that all of what's coming is already in the narrator's head and why she's telling the story she's telling. And so it's really tempting to talk about it. But you know, that would I'd have to be careful. So yeah.
I'm not sure how many of our listeners are keeping up here. I'm really
All right.
not. Just in case you're wondering, if you can have allergies or a nose pin, this is what book talk with Hannah is like when she is here. Gosh, it just goes spiraling into egghead detail. Although
All right. Getting
that
me to talk about that's the other problem with talking about Jane Eyre is there are things that I want to talk about that other people are like, yes, let's
so that
stop.
that shiver between the story that's being told and the story of the story that's being told
Yeah.
by the person later in their life,
Yeah.
you can find that in To Kill a Mockingbird. You can find that in True Grit.
Yes.
Famously, True.
Yes.
It's a mistake that people make with True Grit. They think this doesn't read like it's written by a 16-year-old. Well, no, no, it doesn't read that way. It's the whole point.
Right.
Uh,
Right. Oh
uh,
yeah. And that when I was young, To Kill a Mockingbird definitely would have fit in this category too, a book I read over and over and over. And I have not actually read it again since the reading right after Go Tell a Watchman. Um, and that book just Go Tell a Watchman, I know a lot of people hated it and I understand why, but it just was totally fascinating to me and just totally gave me new insights into what she was doing. And
I hated it the first time I read it. Ironically enough, for this conversation, it completely blossomed for me in the reread.
good, good.
Read, I suddenly
Yeah.
understood. In the first read, I was all obsessed about all the non-textual questions. Did she write this? Is this greedy relatives? Does this bastardize the heritage of To Kill a Mockingbird or whatnot? It was only the second time that I read it as a book,
Yep. Yep.
and just I don't you reach a point when you're reading it as a book. You reach a point where you say, "Well, I don't care what the answer to any of those questions are. I'm just
Right.
dealing with the text in front of me, and it's
Yeah.
wonderful."
And I was actually thinking about how her choices when she later wrote To Kill a Mockingbird were an erasure of so many of the emotions that she clearly was feeling beforehand, assuming that the origin story of the two books was
Assuming that the
true.
origin story is right.
Yeah. And you know that she's coming out with a new book. She's coming out with a new book.
He's coming out with a new book. Yes.
I
Once
can't
upon a
wait.
time, I used to be able to joke about Oprah Winfrey saying that To Kill a Mockingbird was her favorite Harper Lee book, but not anymore. I can't tell that joke anymore.
Mhm.
But before we wrap up, I think we should acknowledge the inevitable here. The inevitable result of this conversation has not been, well, I hope that it's been to deepen people's ideas and thinking about rereading and maybe to get people thinking about their own rereading. The real upshot of this conversation is something else again. This conversation has made inevitable a new booktube event called June Air.
Oh gosh, yes. Oh,
Hannah will run it. Sign up in the comments. We will have a new
yes.
booktube event, June
May
Air.
start in May and June air.
We will, for June Air, we will address head on the problem that we've been talking about. I am sure that no one listening to your channel has any objection to you teaching Jane Eyre. I'm sure that no one is going to object to that.
maybe next June. I don't think it'll happen this June for a
Why
variety of
not? Oh,
reasons.
like you need any time to prepare.
Um, Speaking of which, I don't know how much time we have left, but I have, oh yes, we have 2 minutes. I have a big project that I want to do next year involving rereading some ancients in new translations. So at some point, maybe we can get together and talk about that.
Yeah, I don't make any plans for the next year. I don't think that any of this is going to be happening next year. I don't know. I never understand that when people on BookTube say, "Oh, Brian, I'll just reread. That's a great idea. I'll put that down for 2030." For Pete's sake, you're
Yeah.
70 now. You're not going to be around in 2030.
Yeah. In a world in
Again,
crisis, who knows? Yeah.
well, I'm always conscious of the fact that that among booktubers, I require no preparation for anything. And that's not common, and I'm not saying
Yeah.
that it should be. So nevertheless, June Eyre is enticing.
It is. It
I
is.
haven't reread Jane Eyre in 5 years, so it'd be great to find a copy or download one from
Yeah.
home. Just
We
do
could
it.
do a buddy read.
Who knows what would jump out at me this time?
Yeah.
That's the neat thing about classics. That's why I was curious to know if if any non-classic book, non-canonical book, has a shot at becoming a DNA book.
So, um, Anne Fadiman's book, her nonfiction study, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, is one that I did not read until I was 22 or so, I think, 23, maybe when it came out, maybe. Um, and it very much is there. So you don't have to be super young. And then that's not canonical. I mean, it almost is now, but it certainly wasn't when I read it.
For me, the foremost example is The Uncommon Reader.
Yes, yes.
Read
Well,
it, and
Uncommon Reader
you just feel like
and
it's been a part of you all along.
yeah. And I read that and 84 Charing Cross Road every New Year's Day, um, which is the Uncommon Reader didn't get added in until a little bit later, but both are because they're very short, and I spend New Year's with friends who sleep a little later than I do, even on New Year's Day. And I wake up and I read those, and I can finish it before everybody else is awake. And it, as Sarah at Hardcover Heart says, it's just the perfect start to a happy reading year. Promising lots of good reading.
Well, we should wrap this up before we get cut off in mid-syllable.